Let's do a complete armorer's level disassembly and reassembly of the new Colt Frontier. Hi, I'm Jim Humphrey with Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training, and I've got a pretty nifty little revolver to go through today. This is the Colt New Frontier. It came in a 22 long rifle and a 22 Magnum. This particular one was made back in the early 70s, and it's basically the little brother of the Colt Frontier with a few differences to make this video worth its while. So we'll take you through it and show you how to tear it apart and put it back together again. Of course, before I start any disassembly project, I'm going to remove all live ammunition from the work area, and I'm going to check and double check the firearm is unloaded. With revolvers like this one, I'll check about twice as many cylinders as I think I have. I'll start the disassembly by removing the cylinder. I push down the base pin lock and pull the base pin out, and put the hammer in about half cock, and the cylinder should slide out to the right. There's just a single screw holding on the grips. As always, pull them straight away from the backstrap. To remove the backstrap assembly, there are 5 screws, 2 in the back, 3 in the bottom. I have to remove all 5 of those. But first I've got to get the mainspring out of tension. Now there's no tensioning screw on the New Frontier like there is on the Frontier. So I'm going to put a little non-marring wedge in here to disengage the mainspring from the hammer, so that I can remove these 5 backstrap assembly screws. There are a couple of different kinds of screw here, so I'm going to be very careful to keep track of which hole they came out of to ensure I get them back in the right place. I have to be just a little bit careful. There's a spring and detent ball on the right side of the gun that'll fall out when I remove the backstrap assembly. So I have to put a little pressure on the assembly as I remove those last couple of screws, as I can control the release of that spring. I'm careful to release that spring slowly so I can keep track of it. In particular, I'm cautious after I pull the spring out of what's underneath it. There's a little detent ball under there. If I'm not careful, I could drop it by accident and, well, never see it again. And then the gauge just comes out. I might make a quick comment about these screws. Each of these screws is supposed to have a little plastic washer on it. They can come off when you're pulling them out of the holes, and they're easy to lose. In fact, this gun's been taken apart before, and about half the washers were missing. Now I can relieve the pressure on that mainspring. And knock out the stock pin. With the stock pin removed, I can knock out the mainspring, but I want to make sure the top of it here is not touching the side so I don't scratch it when it starts to vibrate. A few taps will knock it out, or at least get it loose enough that I can press it out with my hands. So with the mainspring out, that's pretty much it for the backstrap assembly. So we'll look at the frame. There's a couple of screws here, one for the hammer, one for the trigger. Underneath here, one for the bolt trigger spring. There's the screw for the ejector assembly. There's the base pin lock assembly and the rear sight assembly. I'll start with the bolt trigger spring. It's got a single screw that holds it in, and I'll be careful to notice the orientation when I pull that out. Now I can pull the trigger screw out, and the trigger just drops out and the bolt will come out right behind it. The hammer screw, yeah, will come out pretty easily, but when I pull the hammer out, be careful to hold on to that hand assembly that's in there. It's got a spring on it, so I'll press them out together, and there they are. The hand just is pinned to the hammer, so we can just pull it apart to separate it. It's got a little spring and a pin on it. The ejector tube screw is all that holds the ejector tube in. It slides forward and out a little bit. It's got a spring and a rod inside. I'll notice that spring has a tapered end on one end, so it goes in that way. And I'll just put it all back together real quick, set it aside. The base pin lock nut does take a special driver. I've made these out of old screwdrivers in the past, but I finally found a kit that had these tips in them. There's 3 pieces to this assembly. There's that special nut that has the special blade requirement, and then there's a spring, and there's the lock pin itself. So I'll put those back together to keep track of them. Now the rear sight, there's one main screw and there's a pin. Before I take it apart, I'm going to measure this gap under the rear sight so that I don't have to re-zero the revolver when I put the sights back on. I'm going to loosen that screw, but I'm not going to pull it because there's a detent ball and spring underneath it, and pretty easy to lose. When I knock this pin out, I'll be able to remove the whole rear sight assembly, and when I look underneath it, I'll be able to see there are a number of other small springs and various miscellaneous parts that are held together with another little pin that can come out pretty easily. So I'll just keep that assembly together for now. The firing pin is held in place by this recoil plate pin, which holds the recoil plate, which holds the firing pin. So we'll first we'll knock out this recoil plate pin. To get the firing pin out, I have to hammer it against the recoil plate. So I'll give a few taps here. We'll look inside against the breech face, and you'll see the recoil plate starting to come out. So we'll just knock that all the way out. And you'll see we have the recoil plate with a recoil plate spring inside it, and the firing pin. That's pretty much it for the receiver. Let's put it all back together. The recoil plate is held in place by that recoil plate pin, so we have to make sure that lines up with the pinhole, but it's pretty straightforward. I want to put the firing pin in there and the recoil plate and spring. Then I'm going to use a brass rod to seat that recoil plate back against the breech face until it's flush. And that should line up the pinhole. And then I'll, of course, use a brass punch to knock it in until it's flush. To reinstall this rear sight, I'm going to first put that retention pin in. Just set it so I can have it lined up. Make sure I got all my screws and springs on that rear sight. Set it in there. And then just start the screw. Now I'll use an alignment pin on the off side to line up the rear sight with the pinhole and apply the right amount of pressure to the springs with my thumb. Then I can tap it through pretty easily. And set it flush, of course. I'll adjust the gap so I have basically the same elevation setting. Now we're on to the ejector rod assembly. At the bottom of the ejector rod there's a little lip. It fits inside the frame. Set the one screw, give it a quick test. Yep, that's about all there is to that. I'll reassemble that base pin lock. The spring goes on the nut side. We have the hammer hand assembly of the hammer screw. So first I'll reassemble the hand and the hammer. Now to put this together, I have to press the hand and the spring down in this little slot, and drop the hammer into the frame. And I'll line up the screw hole, insert the screw. Of course, this is a screw, not a pin, so no hammering on this. And then tighten that into place. Now if I've installed it correctly, the hand should move in coordinated fashion with the hammer. The remaining parts of the bolt, the trigger, the bolt trigger screw, bolt spring screw, and the bolt and trigger spring. The bolt and trigger just drop into place. They're a little tricky to align, so I'll use an alignment punch. I'll bring it in from the right side so I can bring the trigger bolt screw up to the left. Now I can drop in the trigger bolt spring and tighten it into place. Now I can do an intermediate function check, just applying hand force to simulate the mainspring, and make sure that the hand and bolt are moving in a coordinated fashion. Reinstalling the mainspring, I have to apply a little bit of hand force. I'll push up in the middle and pull back on the tail, and I can pretty much drop it in by hand, and then with a few taps of the hammer I can get everything to line up properly. And then I'll reset that stock pin. Make sure, of course, that it's equal on both sides. Next, I have the gate detent spring, the detent, and the loading gate to install. And I've recompressed the mainspring with that non-marring wedge. With the gate in place, I can drop the detent ball in there, follow it up with the spring, and of course, keeping everything held vertically, I can drop the backstrap assembly on it and compress that spring. Now I can reinstall the screws. I'll start with the bottom ones just to hold that spring in place. I'll install the 5 screws a little bit loose, and then I'll make sure I got the frame aligned with the backstrap before I snug them all up. Once the screws are snug, I can remove that mainspring wedge and reinstall the grips. With the cylinder reinstalled and locked into place, I can do a quick function check. Make sure everything's operating smoothly and correctly.
Well, I hope you found that interesting. I'm Jim Humphrey from Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. Remember, enjoy your firearms, join the NRA, and be safe out there. Thanks for watching.